Welcome to the NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneur Workshop Series. Today's session is focused on corporate governance and management. We'll be talking through three core areas: management team and advisors, governing bodies, legal and corporate entities. We also wanted to let you know that this is part of a series, and you have an opportunity to register for our next one, which is on April 27th, focused on intellectual property. We'll also have a session on June 22nd, focused on licensing and partnering agreements, as well as future dates to be announced on competition and differentiation, regulatory strategy, pitching and promoting your company, as well as investment funding. You're going to hear from some of our guest speakers today who will give a brief overview, and we welcome you to offer your questions while they're doing their overview. The majority of our session will then be in breakout rooms featuring our moderated Q&A with our expert panelist, and you'll be able to join a breakout room focused on building an advisory and management team with Dr. Don Rose, building your board of directors and corporate governance with Luis Gutierrez, as well as incorporation and corporate entities with Jennifer Fang. I want to remind you again to please fill out that feedback form. And I want to make sure that you also know that to participate in the breakout rooms, it's very important that you have an updated Zoom. We will allow you to see a breakout room at the bottom, but we will chat out that link in case you haven't updated your Zoom link in a while. It will just make sure that you can access the breakout rooms. If you have any challenges getting into the breakout rooms, we'll be here to help you. So no worry, we're here to guide you along this whole process. You'll hear today from our featured speakers, as I mentioned, Dr. Don Rose. He's our entrepreneur in residence at the National Institute on Aging at the National Institutes of Health. We're also joined by Luis Gutierrez, our entrepreneur in residence from the National Heart, Lung, and Lung Institute at NIH, as well as Jennifer Fang, corporate partner at Wilson Sonsini. My name is Monique Larocque, and I'll be your moderator for today. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jen.
Thank you, Monique. I want to thank the NIA, NHLBI, and in particular, Dr. Don Rose for inviting me to speak on today's panel. This is one of my favorite topics. So as Monique mentioned, I'm a partner at Wilson Sonsini. It's one of the preeminent law firms, top 50 law firms in the country, and we focus primarily on working with early stage startups. Companies you may recognize include Google, who we represented when they were just two founders working out of a garage, and we ride the success, partner with the companies and ride the success as they become multinational global companies and build out their legal teams with the support of our entire firm, whether it's litigation, employment help, tax, anything. And as a role as a corporate partner, what I do is I'm acting as the general counsel for most of these companies before they hire the general counsel, tackling all the different issues. But first, we have to form the company, right? And so maybe we can go to the next slide. And so today in a breakout session, I will be addressing my top 5 incorporation questions. These are the frequently asked questions that I get from clients and clients to be. One is, when should I form an entity? Great question. 2 is, what kind of entity? 3 is, who is considered a founder? 4 is, how much equity should I get? And how much equity should I give to the different advisors and co-founders? And what's a reasonable size for an option pool? So if you come to my breakout room, I feel like this is an advertisement, but if you come to my breakout room, we can address some of these questions and decide whether these are easily answered or whether you'll need to have further discussion. Next slide. And here are the top 10 incorporation pitfalls. One I like to say is not having the prenup conversation. So when you're forming a company, you are probably going to be working more than anybody else in your family. And it's so important to make sure that your co-founders and your core team, that you are on the same page. And so many times we find that founders fail to have very clear conversations around their expectations, around what their actual commitments are and when they're going to walk away. And that's a number one problem for founders. They end up falling apart. Maybe you have a member of one of four who ends up walking away after a year for various personal reasons. No one faults them, but having these conversations, planning for this is critical, as it actually can translate to a lot of legal tools that we can use to essentially facilitate any of these outcomes that will happen later on. And it's very common that the founding teams don't stay together. And so we just need to be able to help the company accommodate for those situations. 2 through 10, overvaluing idea or past work and rewarding equity, not leaving enough to incentivize future contributors. I can say that if everyone gave me just 5 cents to say, hey, I wish I didn't do this, I would be a millionaire. 3, failure to use vesting or overly liberal use of acceleration. This also ties to the fact that like the reality is that there are going to be people who are going to work with the company and they will leave. Messing up 83B filings. If you don't know what those are, very important that we talk about it. This impacts the taxes if you're getting any stock in any startup. Promising percentages rather than specific numbers of shares. We get this all the time where we ask our clients, hey, who have you promised shares to? And they give us a bunch of percentages and the percentages don't add up to 100, and that's a real problem. Ignoring, and even if it does add up to 100, you can also have problems, particularly if you've seen social network, you'll know what I'm talking about. Ignoring potential conflicts. This is really critical for a lot of the people who are attending here, because you may have conflicts of interest policies that are attached to your employment. And particularly if you're under multiple agencies and you have grants from multiple departments, you really have to be careful about navigating conflicts. 7, failing to properly establish necessary corporate governance, setting up board approving officers. There's a reason why companies are formed. One of them is that you want to have protection on your liability. And a critical part about making sure that a court will respect the company and give you that limited liability is that you actually respect the company. And so it's important to make sure that you set up the corporate governance and you treat it as if it's an actual entity. 8, putting people on the board who don't understand their fiduciary duties. And this is a broader point in terms of you want to make sure that you have the right people. Unfortunately, everyone on this panel, or maybe unfortunately, has many experiences with people that we know who may not have put the right people on their board or management teams. And in any of the sessions, you should be able to have some great conversations around what are the right people that you want to put on your board and management? And I can certainly address that from a legal perspective. Number 9, failing to actually issue shares and ensuring compliance with federal and state securities laws. Just because these startup companies are private does not mean that they're subject to securities laws. What your lawyers can help you do is find the appropriate exemptions to make sure that you're not in trouble. But securities that are not issued in compliance with the laws or with a valid exemption are actually invalid. And so that will also be a big issue later on if you thought you issued shares 2 years ago when the company was worth nothing, and now the company is looking at a potential $1 billion valuation. Sounds great, except that you may not have that stock, right? So we should make sure we get that done quickly. And lastly, confidentiality versus intellectual property assignments. I think there's a lot of confusion around NDAs and what that means, but you also want to make sure that your IP is handled correctly. So I look forward to speaking with you, and I'm going to pass this on to Luis.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm Luis Gutierrez, entrepreneur and resident at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And I'm speaking today largely from my prior experience on the governing body and on the board of directors. And I have 3 stages that followed a nice chronology that's interesting to share now. My first was as management of a publicly traded company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. That was one level of maturity and formality. Next, it was a private equity-backed multinational company, but private. That was another level. And then third was as the CEO and board member of a private university spin-out startup, which is more the stage you guys are at. But I had the benefit of having come from much more structured environments to that one, that's different, and that served me well. And I know you haven't had that experience for most of you, and part of why I'm here is to share that experience. So once you've sort of gone through Jennifer's world and you've set up an entity, you then have to govern that entity. And that typically, certainly for a C Corp, involves having a formal board of directors. What are its roles and responsibilities, which are to advise, evaluate, and in some cases replace the CEO. I've actually been on boards of where we had to replace the CEO. You participate in the strategic decision-making that affects all stakeholders, including budgeting over multiple time horizons, so meaning not only annual, but longer term as well. Product development and other key investment priorities. A lot of these companies have a bit of IP, and what's the path forward, and what do we invest in that's going to get us that early stage valuation that then enables everything else? And how do we make sure that we're following a development pathway that is risk mitigated in a way that we won't run out of money? Because for most of your companies in the audience today, the overarching worry that haunts every night worth of sleep is, will I run out of money before getting to a place where I can go raise more? The board can also be very helpful in executive hires. While it is the CEO's decision to make, contact pools, recruiting pools, and frankly, second opinions about key executive hires are places where a board often gets involved, and certainly opining on, but perhaps even helping identify and manage merger and acquisition opportunities for the company along the way. Other things the board does: evaluate and authorize investment vehicles. So what will our next investment round look like? What instrument will we use? What impact will that have on existing shareholders? How will existing shareholders be able to participate, et cetera? And then, the board is ultimately accountable to the shareholders, and in many cases to other stakeholders as well, especially ex-US. Some related issues that if you come to my breakout room instead of Jennifer's or Don, you'll get to ask questions on issues like governance versus management. The board does governance. The management team does management. That's very, very clear at a New York Stock Exchange public company. It gets increasingly muddled as you get down to a startup environment as to where is that line, but you need to know what the formal roles are. The roles of board chair and president and CEO. Is that one person? Is it two people? There are pros and cons. There's not a correct answer, but there are pros and cons to both approaches that the board should consider. The role of inside versus outside or independent board members, and what's an appropriate mix, and what qualifies somebody to be a board member I've already, through the registration process, have some questions to that regard, but happy to discuss it further in the breakout room, as well as the notion of a board of directors, which has a very precise definition and role, versus other types of advisory boards, including those Don will touch on in just a moment. And then mechanical issues of what's the size, the composition, committee structure, terms, how to actually manage a board and board meetings and a board over time. I'll be hitting all of those in more detail in my breakout session. So without further ado, I tee up our third panelist, Dr. Don Rose.
Thank you, Louis. Appreciate it. Just by way of background, I spent the last 10 years before coming to NIA as an entrepreneur resident. I spent that time at University of North Carolina helping to launch companies, and we launched about 85 companies over that decade. And so I'm coming at this at those early steps in the process of actually some of the steps of gathering advisors prior to even incorporation of the company, but also bringing on management as you go into the more formal development of the company. So at the core of what we're going to talk about today is this kind of the chicken and the egg sort of idea of, it's a question that's asked by everybody, is how do I attract talent with no funding, and how do I attract funding with no talent? And so that's a real conundrum for early stage companies. And so we're going to address this as part of my breakout room if you happen to come to attend. So first thing I want to talk about are advisors. And advisors encompasses a very large group of people with various sort of levels of interaction. So what I've done is I've laid out for you kind of a classic 2x2 graph as you can think of where these people fit into the kind of the advisor world. And so there are scientific type advisory efforts, and then there are more business oriented advisory efforts. And then those range from informal advisors to more formal advisors. And so on the more formal side, you have these boards that you can create, a scientific advisory board or perhaps a business advisory board. On the less formal side are just domain experts, people that you've hired as perhaps corporate counsel. And then I kind of dropped in the middle consultants. Consultants in a sense are advisors as well. They're paid advisors, if you will, but they have a critical role in advising the company outside of the normal sort of employment interaction or engagement that you may have with that person. So let's talk about kind of the scientific advisory board as kind of one of the key advisory board. And I'll talk more about this in the breakout session, but they're really kind of two categories. They're kind of the rock stars that have the National Academy or Nobel laureates, perhaps. And some people may call that window dressing, whatever you want to call it. That can be an attractant for people who want to look at your company. And then you have more domain experts, and they're going to be providing advice, guidance, and probably doing some heavy lifting when it comes to thinking about the technical development or scientific development of your product. And the members of the scientific advisory board need to be aligned with both the therapeutic focus and the company stage. Are you preclinical now? You may need preclinical advisors. Are you clinical stage? You may need clinical advisors, and so on. On the business advisory board side, these are very important. In fact, I would say that most companies that are SBIR and STTR funded have a strong technical focus, technical founding team, and the so on. So building out a business advisory board can be extremely important. A formal board perhaps is less common. You may see it occasionally, but in the background, there may be a bunch of business advisors that are kind of, maybe they're the pre-management team or pre-emergent management team. And so they're helping to provide advice as you're developing the business side of your company. And again, this is a good way to initially recruit those board of director members as well as the management team. So tips and practices. I think that kind of the format I would think about is kind of layers of advisement, starting with a broader network. And we'll talk more about networks in the breakout room, but you can think of a broad network. And then within that broader network, there are some informal advisors. And within that galaxy of formal advisors, there are advisory boards. And then, as Louis talked about, the most formal advisors, if you will, are the board of directors. And then I think it's important when you create either advisory boards or even groups of advisors to have regular engagements. I think it's been nice to see companies that just send me a quarterly update of where they're doing. I'm not even on an advisory board, and I just get these quarterly updates, and who knows what'll happen. I may say, oh yeah, I happen to know something, that make a connection or whatever. So these updates depend on kind of the level of engagement or the level of formality of the advisory group you have. So you can imagine every 6 to 12 months providing a broad network update, maybe, but for a more formal advisory board, maybe every month or every 4 months or every quarter or so. And then we'll also talk about compensation of these boards. And you can imagine it's a broad range, but it typically involves some sort of equity. So again, the management team typically consists of business leadership and technical leadership, and there are a variety of roles, which makes this whole area fairly complex. So it's good to kind of sort through all the roles and titles and engagement levels that you could imagine someone being involved with your company. So lots of roles, from fundraising to partnerships to product development and to operations. There are a variety of titles, and we'll talk about the chiefs, and we'll talk about kind of the levels of engagement. There's not necessarily one level of engagement. You can have a wide variety of everybody from part-time to full-time, consultants, contractors, and the like. So if we look at the management team itself, when you think about recruiting management, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, but think about recruiting management the same way you're trying to recruit money or raise money. The management's investing their time, and you need to create a compelling story and really sell the opportunity to management and keep them on board. There's something called the stray cat theorem and the starter CEO, which we can go into in the breakout room when it comes to bringing in management and who you can get at the early stages of your company. Big part of this is dating before you get engaged. So make sure you know who it is. I mean, when your company goes from one person to two people, that's a big shift in terms of chemistry versus 100 people to 101 people. So that chemistry has got to be right early on because of the impact that person has. And Jennifer mentioned vesting and the cliff, and we'll talk about kind of how vesting can happen when bringing on management. One of the options that Luis may go into is managing from the board level. Sometimes you may have an executive director who's on the board who's providing some management input before a formal management team is in place. And I think it's important to think about titles, both for the founders and also for the management, and we'll talk more about that. Just as a reminder, we have a number of these workshops ongoing. And so this just, as was mentioned earlier, we have one coming up on intellectual property and licensing and partnering. Those have some dates associated with them. You can register for the intellectual property one now. That links have been put into the, or will be put into the chat at some point. And then we have a number of other ones that are to be determined in terms of the dates. Monique, back to you.
Thank you so much, Don, and to all of you, Luis and Jen. We really appreciate all of your expertise to help guide us today. I want to just remind you that if you do have questions, we see that some people are already sending them through. Please feel free to continue to chat them to us. We do want to encourage you to connect with us. So we have included in the chat as well some of the links that you'll see on your screen so that you can access us on the web, as well as join us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and also to see some of our upcoming events and news that are coming out in your way. I did want to note that we have similar information for NHLBI as well, if you want to connect with them.